Villages are normally a peaceful place to find resources and hide away from the mobs of the world. But what happens when one villager's curiosity changes him for the worse? Just how dark and twisted will his path lead him to become? Dive into the lore with us as we explore the origin of the Blood Giant Villager. It all began with one villager's sin of curiosity. In the heart of a sprawling taiga biome, nestled amongst the towering spruce trees and mossy undergrowth, lay a quiet village. Its residents lived simple lives, trading, farming, and tending to their individual responsibilities. All of them, aside from one, a villager whose curiosity set him apart from the rest. While the other villagers found fulfillment in routine, he sought something more. The knowledge of the forbidden called to him, practices whispered of only in hushed tones, brought to life by the witches and vindicators. He thought that unlike those evil mobs of the world, he might be able to use the forbidden spells for good. Carefully, the villager added another glowing potion into his cauldron, which began to bubble up, filling the room with an eerie red light. The curious villager marveled at the sight, eager to continue this forbidden ritual. Such practices were frowned upon in the village, though, and thus far he had not been successful. So he kept his experiments a secret, hidden from the rest of the community. Unfortunately for him, secrets have a way of unraveling themselves. One fateful night, beneath the light of the full moon, the villager was conducting the latest of his experiments. He was sure that he was close to an answer, a method of unlocking the secrets of magic and brewery. In his home, he stood before a crudely crafted altar, where he took out an ancient tome and began to chant passages from it. As the words took hold, the air grew cold, and an unnatural wind swept through the forest. Despite the chill down his spine, he stubbornly continued the ritual, believing that perhaps this time his plan would work. But the villager had made a grave mistake. In his effort to seek enlightenment, he had instead courted death. Originating in his very own home, the onslaught of zombies began, pouring forth from his altar. Sensing him, they immediately turned on their summoner. The villager, horrified, scrambled up the stairs and barred the passageway, preventing the creatures from following him. But for the rest of the village, it was too late. The community awoke to the sound of shattering wood and guttural groans. Panic spread like wildfire as the zombies swarmed the homes, breaking down doors and windows. Villagers who stumbled from their homes to escape found themselves surrounded by the horde. The community bell rang frantically as the villagers scrambled toward the center square, forming a desperate defensive line behind the scant few iron golems they had. For every zombie felled, two more took its place. Though the iron golems fought valiantly, it was quickly made apparent that they would not hold out forever. The villager guilty of causing the disaster searched around his home hysterically for something that might help the situation. But despite his years of research, he had nothing. The village was doomed. Just when it seemed as if all hope was lost, a sudden stroke of luck turned the tide. The sky brightened with the first hints of dawn, and as the light touched the village, the zombies hissed in agony as their flesh began to burn. Those that remained watched in awe as the zombies staggered back, their movements slowing as they died. Some succumbed to the fire, while others fled into the dense shadows of the trees. Though the village had survived the attack, it was not without loss. The scars the massacre created would last forever. Still hidden in his home, the villager clutched his book, guilt tightening around his heart as he observed the devastation he caused. It didn't take long for the others to put the pieces together. Following the trail of destruction, the other villagers were soon led to the scene of the crime. After entering into his home, the villager's fate was sealed. None of his pleading or excuses would work, because they had seen the truth. They accused him of cursing them with his dark magic, and said that they had trusted him, and he had betrayed them. The rest of the residents, those who he believed to be his family and friends, turned their backs on him, casting him out of their home. Ostracized and alone, the villager began to wander the wilderness, his heart heavy with guilt and bitterness. After days of endless walking, the villager had consumed the last of his supplies. The days had been rough on him, the weather unkind, and he longed for his bed back at the village that he was banished from. Without entry, though, he had to fend for himself. Finally, he found shelter in a distant cave, far from the judgmental eyes of his former neighbors. As the darkness of night deepened, he sat alone in the dim light of a torch, staring hollowly at a crude map of the surrounding region. Quietly, he swore to himself that he would make them understand, and then they would welcome him back. He leaned up against the wall as exhaustion overcame him, his eyes growing heavy. Just as the villager was drifting off to sleep, he heard a deep, rumbling growl. As he shot up, he peered into the darkness. Ahead, he could barely make out two glowing eyes in the dim light. He shakily called out to the eyes, asking who was there, but the only response he received was another low growl. Shakily, he stepped back, further and further, until his back hit the wall of the cave. It was then that the source of the sound strode into the dim light. 2 hungry wolves were approaching him. It seemed that luck was no longer on the villager's side. The creatures seemed gaunt and desperate, just like him, he thought, but it didn't stop the terror from flooding his veins at the sight of them. He leaped wildly out of the way as the first wolf lunged at him, its teeth raking across his body. As a villager, he had no experience fighting. Thus, he barely managed to fend off the wolves as they took turns lunging at him, blood-staining him as he stumbled back toward the cave entrance. He shouted at the feral beast to stay back, to no avail, as one leapt at him again, sending him tumbling backward. He scrambled to get away, running back into the forest, his breath ragged in his chest. Injured and terrified, the villager fled into the night, the howls of the wolves following closely behind. Blood dripped from his wounds, staining the forest floor as he stumbled onward. The villager pleaded to himself. It couldn't end like this. The villager ran blindly through the forest, weaving between rocks and thick trees. He leapt over a narrow ravine, his heart pounding. A yelp sounded behind him. One of the wolves hadn't made it, but another still followed relentlessly. He sprinted as fast as his legs could take him, as the creature snapped at his heels, nearly causing him to stumble. The villager jumped over a fallen log, then burst through dense bushes into a clearing, where he spotted a squat, ruined tower. With no other choice, the villager threw himself toward it, scrambling up the vines at its side. The beast's jaws snapped inches from his feet, but the villager kept climbing. Eventually, he reached the top, where he looked down at the wolf, who clawed at the base of the tower. It scratched and scratched, but the villager held his breath, remaining as still and quiet as possible. At last, the wolf seemed to give up, snarling and retreating back into the trees. He let out a sigh of relief. He had made it. The attack left him battered and shaken, but alive. Yet as he clumsily attempted to search the tower for supplies to heal himself, the villager couldn't shake the feeling that even the forest had turned against him. Every sound, every shadow, felt like a new threat waiting to strike. Tired and bloodied, the villager figured that this was a place to hide, at least for now. As dawn once again crept over the horizon, the villager took stock of his surroundings. The topmost chamber of the tower he found himself in was littered with remains of a past long forgotten. The villager began exploring, descending the worn staircase to the next level. His footsteps sounded loud in the hollow tower. Upon reaching the last stair, he realized that he had entered into some sort of arcane study. An empty cauldron rested in the center of the room, its contents long since dried to nothing. Torn pages of parchment littered the floor, and he rifled through the remnants, wondering of their origin. It crossed his mind that this could be a sorcerer's lair, or perhaps something more. After descending once more, the villager reached the ground floor, where there was shattered furniture and broken relics. A massive tome sat atop an obsidian pedestal, with more strange runes floating around it. As the villager approached it, his breath caught in his throat. It was an object he had only heard of in rumor and old books, an enchantment table. Upon reaching it, the book turned toward him and opened, revealing its secrets to him. Though they were written in an ancient script, something about the text felt familiar, and the villager realized that he could read them. Suddenly, he went still as a gust of cold wind blew by him. Something wasn't right. Turning slowly, he spotted a trap door he hadn't noticed before. It was open, and it appeared to lead into nothing but darkness. Unease gnawed at him, but despite the cold, he burned with curiosity. The knowledge here was more vast than he ever could have imagined. Surely there was something more down there. Against every instinct, the villager decided to descend. The air grew heavier with every rung he traveled down. He made it to the bottom, where the shadows were so dark he could hardly see. The only illumination was from some strange lichen that had overtaken the walls, which glowed with a faint, ghostly light. The villager had a feeling that he had discovered the keep of a long-gone necromancer. The wealth he had stumbled upon was enormous. Perhaps in these ruins, he could build himself anew. As he stepped forward to inspect the items, he failed to notice something at his feet. The arrow shot out from a concealed dispenser, striking him straight in the chest. He stumbled backward, shaking his head. Though he was hurt, it didn't seem too serious. Besides, he was more interested in what these ruins had to offer him. Weeks turned into months. The villager's solitude deepened, and so too did his obsession. He thought that maybe if he could prove himself, maybe his village would accept him back. He continued with his experiments and pored over the vast knowledge in the ruins, seeking to redeem himself or find answers in his failures. But it seemed everything was out to betray him, even the villager's own body. A strange illness took hold of him, one that seemed to taint his very blood. His thoughts turned to the arrow that had pierced him on his first day in the ruin. The tip had been tainted with something foul, some kind of necrotic magic. He knew not of the origin, but he knew he had to fight through it. In his mind, there was no way that he could stop now, not after everything he had been through. But his body continued to be racked with violent coughing fits. As the latest one ran its course, crimson liquid stained the floor of the tower. The villager stared at it, its unnatural darkness filling him with dread. A chill went down his spine as he felt the presence of the entity again. It was something that had been haunting him ever since contracting his blood disease.
They cast you out. They hate you.
As the voice whispered in his ear, he tried to shake it off. He had to fight through it, whatever this was. With great difficulty, he drank another one of his brews. It granted him some relief, but not enough. Despite his attempts to mitigate it, the effects of whatever was happening to him continued to creep onward.
Let it consume you. Aren't you curious?
As the villager tried to continue with his experiments, his body started to give out. He could no longer control many of his own movements. It was at this point that he knew he needed help. In his condition, though, and with his reputation as an outcast, there were few places he would find it. With reluctance, he trudged out of the tower and into the wilderness, headed for the one person he believed to be his only hope. Desperation drove the villager to seek aid from those as shunned as himself. In the heart of a swamp, surrounded by fog and slimy creatures, he found a hut. It was crooked and weathered, its windows glowing with a sickly green light, but inside was the occupant he searched for. A lone witch. The witch didn't turn when he entered her hut, but as she tended to her cauldron, she spoke to him as if she had foreseen his arrival for ages. She asked him what he had come for, but the villager had the feeling that she already knew what for. He moved forward and begged for her help. There was something wrong with him. His blood was changing, and the villager felt it eating away at him like a parasite. She was his only hope. Suddenly, a familiar voice whispered in the back of his head.
Kill her.
The villager shook off the whispers as the witch's eyes glinted with curiosity and malice. She agreed to help him, but for a price. He agreed, knowing that he would be unable to solve his affliction himself. The witch nodded and led him down into some sort of cellar, deep beneath her hut. It sent shivers up the villager's spine, but he reminded himself that he needed to do this. When they arrived at the base, she prepared a potion, her movements deliberate and measured, as she picked each ingredient and tossed it into her brew. When it was ready, she handed it to the villager, urging him to drink it. The villager drank deeply, the bitter liquid burning as it slid down his throat. Almost instantly, pain racked his body, and he barely avoided crashing to the ground in agony. He asked the witch what she had fed him, and she replied that his affliction ran deeper than she had anticipated. The villager would need stronger magic.
She's poisoned you. Kill her.
The villager shuddered, shaking his head. No, he would not listen to this voice. Suddenly, he could no longer control his body. In a flash of motion, he sprinted at the witch. She barely had time to turn around before he was standing over the remains of her body, killed instantly. With a start, the villager pulled back, and suddenly, he was back in the real world. It had been a vision. He shuddered and nodded to the witch, who beckoned him to follow her. The witch summoned two others of her kind. They said they could help, but magic demanded a balance. Was the villager willing to pay it? He agreed, knowing that he had to get better no matter the price. If one witch couldn't save him, maybe three would. The witches had him stand on a stone altar as they chanted in unison, preparing a stronger potion than before. The concoction bubbled violently, glowing an ominous red. When it was ready, they bottled it and forced him to drink it, ignoring his struggles. The villager nearly doubled over as the concoction took hold. The pain was unbearable. His screams echoed across the swamp as the potion did its work, twisting his body further, corrupting him more and more. He cried out, asking what they had done to him, but the witches just cackled and told him that they had brought out what was already there. He was a marvel, a little miracle of suffering.
You brought this on yourself. Let the power grow. Take revenge.
The potion amplified the disease, twisting it further. The villager's blood burned like fire, and he dripped the red substance like sweat, unable to curb its flow. At last, it reached a tipping point. Shards of blood, pointed like spears, burst out of him, breaking him free of the altar's hold. The witches screamed, stumbling backward as he staggered free.
You want to kill them. Do it.
In the villager's mind's eye, he saw himself lunge forward and destroy the witches. He felt how wonderful it would feel to end them once and for all. He staggered back as the vision came to a close, shaking his head. No, he wouldn't do it. The witches cackled as they watched him struggle to climb up the ladder to get away from them. Overcome with rage and pain, he stumbled out of the hut, leaving behind the sound of their laughter echoing in his ears. He ran until he knew they could no longer find him, and found shelter under a tree to try and catch his breath. His hope for salvation had turned to despair. The witches had worsened his curse, pushing him further and further down a dark path the villager feared there was no return from. As the disease progressed, the villager's mind began to fracture. What he had feared most was now coming to light. The disease was no longer just physical. In his effort to stop the disease, he had passed a threshold that he couldn't come back from. With no place to call home and no way to help himself, he walked through the lands of the overworld, mind lost in a fog. One night, consumed by delirium, he stumbled upon a group of hermit villagers living in the mountains. He was starving, and he thought that maybe they would be kind souls enough to feed him. He approached the small cabin and peeked inside the window. Within the home, there appeared to be a couple, along with a dog. He knocked on the door, and sure enough, one of the hermits answered. He gasped at the state of the villager. Indeed, he was a bloody mess. Even the dog approached cautiously, and after sniffing him, emitted a low growl. Luckily, they let him inside and offered him some fresh bread. But as the villager stared at the loaf, his mind twisted, and with a distant horror, he had realized that his stomach would not be satisfied with such a simple meal. No, he craved something warmer, something fresher.
You hunger. Give in.
The villager could not stop himself. He lunged forward like a crazed beast and began to attack the kindly hermits. Within moments, they were dead, and he feasted like a starved animal. When his mind cleared, the villager stumbled back from the horrific scene, hardly able to believe what he had done. He shook his head as he backed away until his back hit the wall, and he could retreat no further.
Do not despair. You're becoming something greater.
He realized he had become a monster, a terrible, horrible monster that needed help. There was only one place he could think of that might be able to provide such a thing. With uneven steps, he staggered away from the cabin and back to the one place he hadn't ever thought he would return to. Lost and broken, he returned to the only place he had ever truly called home. But as he neared the village, he saw that it had changed. New walls had been built, surrounding the perimeter. Iron golems patrolled the borders, heads turning to scan for intruders. As he advanced to the tall gateway, the golems quickly approached him. At first, he thought it was to welcome him, but they blocked his path, stopping him from going any further inside. The villager called out, confused, and that was when the others appeared. The villagers swarmed to the entrance, keeping their distance as they eyed him with morbid, disgusting curiosity. He slowly began to realize that to them, he was no longer a villager, but some kind of horrific creature, as if he were some common zombie or skeleton, a creature to be feared and destroyed. He heard their whispers. They called him unnatural, an abomination. They began to step back from him, gathering behind the iron golems. You're not safe here, he thought, but just as quickly recoiled from the idea.
What's one more body? Or two? Or three? You have killed before. Your hands are tainted.
The villager shook his head. No, he wouldn't do it. One of the iron golems stepped up, looking down at him menacingly. Hidden amongst the crowd, someone called out to him. He should have died in the wild, where he belonged, they said. The words stung more than any wound. He tried to speak, but no words came out, only a low guttural growl that wasn't his own. He stepped forward, but as he did, the nearest iron golem blocked him, its hulking frame barring him from going any further. Before he could blink, it swung with a mighty fist.
Dodge!
The villager barely ducked out of the way, the golem barreling by him. The angry mob shouted in unison, hurling items at him, casting him out. The iron golems gave chase to him, their movements unnaturally fast, their heavy footfalls shaking the very earth. He ran, his body aching, his mind unraveling with every step. The last thing he heard as he disappeared into the forest shattered his heart. Never come back. He ran, consumed by terror. The village's torches flickered behind him, growing smaller and smaller as he fled into the darkness of the woods. Once again sobbing at the rejection of his own kind, he grieved, stumbling his way through the trees. Behind him, the iron golems relentlessly gave chase, their heavy, thundering steps a constant reminder of his position in the world. Hunted, unwanted, set to be eliminated. The villager stumbled into a clearing and found himself face to face with a sheer cliff. He was trapped. As he turned to face the two golems, overwhelming anger began to well up in his heart. Was this how it ended? Why was his push to do good so hated? Even as the golem stepped closer, the villager shook his head, whispering to himself, begging his heart to not feel the way it did. The first iron golem took another step, putting it right before him. The villager felt a chill go down his spine as the persistent voice whispered to him again. Compared to his haze of pain and exhaustion, the voice was soothing.
Let go. Give in.
For the first time, the villager listened. His mind clouded over, and red overtook his vision as he lunged forward. The iron golem stood no chance as blood speared out of him, and he savagely mauled them. They were battered and broken in seconds.
Yes. Good.
One more attack and the golems were finished. They crumbled to the ground in pieces. A sudden chill broke the villager out of his fog. He stumbled back, once more seeing the horror he had wrought. But it felt good.
I know how you feel.
The villager quickly whirled around, looking around wildly for the source of the voice. He felt a lump rise in his throat, and for some reason, his instincts screamed to him to not call out. The villager backed away slowly, holding his breath so as to make as little noise as possible. A figure appeared out of the trees, approaching him slowly but steadily. He was tall, with glowing white eyes. He reminded the villager of the shadow that had been following him since finding the lonely tower. The villager once again found his back pressed up against the sheer face of the cliff, though this time he sensed that if he were to attack, he would be the one who ended up like the golems.
You and I are not so different.
Herobrine. The name mysteriously came to the villager's mind as his dark guardian stepped closer.
Let me tell you a story. I was once like you, abandoned, forgotten, a mistake in the design of this world.
The villager shook his head, not believing what he was hearing.
They feared me, cast me out. They called me a monster.
The entity, who he now knew to be none other than Herobrine, whispered to him about his own life, how he too had been ostracized. The villager stared at Herobrine, seeing his own reflection in those words. The same rejection, the same hatred. It refueled the villager's anger. Were people like himself and Herobrine destined to be condemned? All they had wanted was change. All they had wanted was to help, only to be met with disgust.
I know your pain. I can give you strength.
The villager stared at Herobrine, then nodded once. His anger and misery could no longer be quelled. This time, he would let it free. Herobrine extended his hand toward the villager, and a surge of pain erupted through the villager's body. The pain, more so than ever before, was unbearable. His blood boiled beneath his skin, searing every nerve, tearing through him like fire. He felt his sickness grow, expand, and consume.
Let it take hold. Let your suffering fuel you.
The villager began to grow, his frame expanding, and his limbs thickening. Armed with a mote of Herobrine's essence, he grew in power, his skin darkening to a deep crimson hue. He was no longer just a villager. He was something far worse. The earth trembled as the blood giant villager rose to his full height, his head towering over the trees that once dwarfed him. He stared down at Herobrine, his new form pulsing with raw power. Mind lost, he took a step forward, rage uncontainable. He roared, sending forth a spray of blood toward the other entity. But Herobrine was waiting. He vanished in an instant, reappearing beside the blood giant's head.
You have power, perhaps more than I, but you lack experience.
The blood giant whirled around, once again releasing a torrent of blood. This time, Herobrine allowed the attack to pass through him, staring at the villager with intensity.
You want vengeance? Then take it. Let your fury guide you.
The villager's thoughts turned to everything he had experienced that led him here. What truly drove his anger, his pain. He recalled when he had been a mere, uncorrupted member of the town, and due to one small, simple mistake, he thought, some small deaths, they ostracized him. He remembered the horde of zombies that had stormed from his very own home, how they had torn people to shreds, spilling their blood across the ground. But it should have been a small price to pay for the good of all, thought the villager. It was only thanks to his persistence, his iron will to survive, and some cosmic luck that he had come across that tower. It had saved him, but hadn't it also cursed him? Whispered a voice in his head. A small price to pay, he concluded. The pain fueled him. He never would have ended up in that situation had the villagers not cast him out like some wicked stranger. He never would have had to travel to that witch's hut. He recalled her laughter as he begged for help. That had been a tipping point. The potion they had fed him caused whatever poison the arrow cursed him with to mix with his blood further, transforming him into even more of a terrible creature, sending his mind further into ruin, even causing him to hallucinate murdering them. Maybe he should have killed them. Maybe it would have fed his hunger. When he returned to his home village, seeking help, even the golems had stopped him like he was a monster. It had torn his heart in two. Any remaining love he had was shredded as he understood that he had never been one of them, and nothing he would ever do would satisfy them. Perhaps they were the real monsters, and monsters needed to be killed. The blood giant turned, massive frame like a dark wound against the night sky. In the distance, nestled between the trees, the village stood quiet, peaceful. There was no hesitation or second thoughts. His home had cast him aside. His people had treated him like a monster. Now they would see one. With a low growl, he stepped toward the village. The village slept, unaware of the storm of vengeance approaching from the forest depths. The blood giant moved with terrifying purpose, his rage single-minded, at each step shaking the earth below him. The closer he drew, the more his memories clouded in red. Atop a guard tower, an iron golem spotted the blood giant villager, but he was no match for the monster's devastating attack, which obliterated him instantly. Stepping forward, the blood giant tore through the wall, the defense that had once kept him out crumbling to his feet. The other iron golems lunged at the blood giant, but they were ants to him now. With a swift step, he crushed through their iron plating, rendering them to pieces. The other golem's heavy footsteps woke the villagers as they rushed him. He roared, exploding with a torrent of blood, shaking the world with his power. He crushed the final golem under his feet. The villagers, now realizing what was happening, peered through their windows in terror. The blood giant stepped over the remains of the golems, then let out an ear-splitting roar. It carried through the night, and as its echoes faded, so too did the light. Every torch, every lantern, every source of brightness died, swallowed by darkness, plunging the village into an abyss of shadow. The hunger within the blood giant burned. The villagers swarmed out of their houses, desperate to escape, but it just made his hunt easier. As he consumed villager after villager, his body grew larger. His disease had transformed him into a creature of pure carnage, feeding on the warm souls of the overworld. From here, there was no return. The village, once thriving, now lay in ruins. The giant stood at the center, his body towering, relishing in his conquest. Then, without a word, he turned. A thick fog began to roll in, and he stepped away, his massive form fading into the mist. Just as suddenly as he had come, he was gone. Only the ruin remained, a scar upon the land, a whispered nightmare to be told to the future players that roam the world. And in the shadows of the forest, the creature waits for its next unsuspecting victim, though none can truly satisfy the dark cravings of the blood giant villager.